It's so good to be here with both Councilmember Kshama Sawant and State Senator Nikil Saval. And thank you to the AWW for letting us use their Instagram Live. I'll just introduce our panelists really quick. Kshama Sawant is not a career politician. She's an activist with Socialist Alternative and a rank and file member of the AFT Local 1789, an outspoken socialist who's taken no corporate campaign money. Kshama has won 3 elections despite opposition from big business and Seattle's political establishment, and has helped win working class victories like the $15 an hour minimum wage and the recent Amazon tax on big business. Big business and the right wing have recently launched a recall campaign against her for her strong support of the Black Lives Matter movement and for being an unshaken voice for working people. Kshama only accepts the average worker's wage and after taxes donates the rest of her 6-figure salary to building social justice movements. And Nikil Saval represents the 1st District in the Pennsylvania Senate. He's the author of Cubed, A Secret History of the Workplace, and a former co-editor of the literary magazine N+1. He writes for The New Yorker and The New York Times on architecture and design.
Nikil and Kshama, it's so lovely to have you guys here. Thank you so much for joining us. It's a huge inspiration to, young democratic socialists and socialists everywhere. I kind of want to get us started with, what is really most pressing to everyone right now, which is the COVID crisis, right? So as we're seeing at the moment from the House, we're seeing a very meager bill that is insufficient for the sorts of needs that Americans have. The Pennsylvania Senate Democrats, of course, have unveiled a new plan. And Kshama, I know that you launched a solidarity initiative on your end. So I kind of want to begin by asking about like the big, on the local level, what the real challenges are to getting relief to people, and how the federal gridlock really is affecting your constituents. And I'd love to start with Nikil. I'd love for you to start.
Sure. Thank you, Kamil. Thank you to SOG for having us. I'm very excited by the venture. Really honored to be with a personal inspiration of mine, with Councilmember Sawant. I should say that I am in office as of a few days ago, so there's a little bit of I'm speaking a bit out of turn in the sense that we're just beginning to govern in a formal sense, although obviously I've been an organizer and active and campaigning for several months now. As a member of the state Senate and as the Assembly, the legislature, I mean, there's several levels of blockage. I mean, on the one hand, there is obviously the federal blockage, which prevents there's just a sheer amount of power of the purse that the federal government has. And the states negotiate the kind of nature of stimulus of money that comes through just because of our system, our Madisonian system, which was largely developed to help slaveholders and things like that. I mean, so we know that that's the system, and nonetheless is the system of which I'm a member in some capacity. But what I would say is that also there is a history of being unwilling, even in the Democratic Party, and not to confront, this crisis as a crisis of capitalism, one that is laid bare, saying decades understates the issue of disinvestment, neglect, and kind of increasing corporate control over the economy. So I just sort of feel that we feel that we're entering a stage of the pandemic that is by virtually every measure worse than the previous stage, and in a way in a worse position, because actually having come through the first set of the crisis, having laid bare, I think in many ways we were successful publicly in making clear the importance of housing as a human right, the eviction crisis, we begun to call workers essential, but obviously by no means treat those essential workers as such. I think we've changed the attitudes and publicly understand the nature of the crisis at the same time that there was a historic uprising that brought to the attention the amount of money that we spend on policing and prisons, to the neglect of healthcare, mental health services, and things like that. That said, we haven't really advanced, and so I in many respects the ability to advance policy on those goals. So I think that's where you feel it, and just as someone who's taking office for the first time recently, there's just a huge responsibility that one feels to answer and to deliver services. So, within the moment right now, we, as part of the Senate Democratic Party, we've proposed a bond to float a package of stimulus, essentially. $4 billion, which is about the amount that we got from the CARES Act. By no means do we consider that adequate to meeting the need. I mean, it is a start, I would say, and we've increased certain amounts of housing assistance and things like that to help people, but it's by no means adequate to confronting this, long disinvestment.
Kshama, as somebody who's been in office since 2014, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, how do you see the answer to this question, and also just in terms of how year after year there are roadblocks from the two-party structure, really, and now we're in this urgent crisis where people really need relief but are not getting it.
I think it's appropriate, Kamil, that you have started this discussion with reference to the COVID crisis. As Nikil mentioned, we're heading into an even worse phase of the crisis, and it has to be mentioned that Donald Trump and his reactionary regime are absolutely responsible for a criminal response, or really the lack thereof, to this crisis, which has resulted in over 250,000 American people who have lost their lives. And who knows how many of those lives could have been saved? Who knows how many of the healthcare workers and grocery workers and transit drivers who have faced COVID, if not lost their lives, but have faced massive illness, how many of those illnesses could have been prevented? So it was absolutely crucial that Donald Trump was defeated. This should be recognized as a victory, progressive victory for ordinary people. And it should also be recognized that, the American capitalist system and global capitalism as a whole really has been forced in many countries, been forced to make concessions like the stimulus package that was passed some months ago. But the US is not the only country which has been forced to do that. We've seen that in other countries as well. And they've been forced to do this because of the scale of the crisis, but also because the legitimacy of the capitalist system itself and the parties of capitalism in the US, they happen to be Democrats and Republicans, in the eyes of tens of millions of young people is in tatters. And so they've been forced to make these concessions. But, outside of those factors, I think we have to understand, when you say gridlock in Congress, really, I think what you're referring to is the fact that in reality, there is now we're going to see as the months go by, more and more what they call bipartisan agreement on reducing the amount of stimulus that will pass. I'm quite sure that some stimulus will pass because it will be very difficult for them not to, even though there may be a section of the capitalist class that is opposed to it, section of the reactionaries in the Republican Party that may be opposed to it. But in reality, what is happening is that the Democratic establishment, especially in the form of Pelosi and Schumer, have already backed off or started backing off anyway from the original position that the Democratic establishment had, which is we need at least $1 trillion stimulus. And the emphasis will be placed on this kind of insider negotiation with Mitch McConnell and the right-wing Republicans. And I think that therein lies the crux of, what is it that actually works when ordinary people need to win a decent standard of living, and in this context, actually win an end to this pandemic and this suffering that people are facing. It does not come from this insider dealing between Democratic establishment and the Republican establishment. In reality, we need ordinary people to jump into the stage of history. And we've already seen that in the middle of the pandemic, we saw the largest ever street protest in US history in the form of the Justice for George Floyd movement. And absolutely that movement was in response to the anger against the endemic racism and police violence in our society under capitalism. But it also really captured the deep anger and frustration and disgust that tens of millions of young people are feeling with just the rotten system as a whole, whether they call themselves socialists or not. Many young people are recognizing the system is simply not working for us. And I think that street protest really captured that sort of cumulative anger. But I want to point out, just in this discussion, that it's not only that we see the rottenness and the dysfunctionality of politics as it's on offer through these two parties of capitalism. You see that playing out on the local level as well. I mean, in Seattle, we were able to win the Amazon tax, which is a $214 million tax on the largest corporations, the most profitable, like Starbucks, Amazon, some of the tech corporations. Many of these are actually pandemic profiteers right now. But we won that not because the Democratic Party, which is really politically ruling this city, agreed with us, and we had a very amiable discussion, and then we won it. That was not at all what happened. In Seattle, it was not the Republican Party, but the Democratic establishment that stood in opposition to these meager proposals, really, to bring about some measure of justice. And if it wasn't for the Amazon tax that we won in the height of the Justice for George Floyd movement, the plummeting of the local budget would have been $214 million more. So you can imagine the scale of the crisis we're talking about. But even with that, and this is the point I'm trying to get at, that, fundamentally the local versus federal, I mean, we shouldn't make that dichotomy, because in reality, the dichotomy is between establishment and ordinary people, not between local and federal, because that same power structure plays out everywhere. And so what we are seeing is that the city of Seattle, the city council, I'm one socialist. There are 8 Democrats on the city council. All 8 of those Democrats just weeks ago approved a budget with nearly $200 million in cuts in community services, affordable housing, jobs. So we're seeing the recession being played out in the form of austerity budgets at the local and the state level as well. And in reality, we need, as Nikil was alluding to, we need mass movements of essential workers and labor unions. And really, the labor movement needs to step into the front lines to demand justice. And because that is the only way that history has shown that we can really win anything.
Yeah, totally. I think that really segues into my next question, which, it's such a horrific moment that in addition to just like this awful mismanagement of the pandemic, we're also in a crisis of racial justice. And Seattle included cuts to the police force in the municipal budget that they just passed. And, it's not abolition, but it is a cut. And one of the few cities that have, at least where I live in Boston, a ton of council members are going to be having really high profile primaries in 2021, just because they didn't vote on cuts. And so, I mean, forgive me if I got this wrong, but Kshama, I believe you voted against the overall budget, but voted for the amendments that include cuts. And I'd love to know more about what kind of went into that decision. And especially with the recent controversy over the phrase defund the police, what both of you think is the role of lawmakers in response to this disingenuous framing, and what lawmakers' responsibility is to the mass movement.
Yeah, I'm really glad you talked about this, and really important to know that in other cities as well, ordinary people, young people's movements are pushing back against the lack of response of Democratic Party politicians after all the promises that were made in the summer. I mean, we saw in a spectacular way, we saw this play out in the city of Minneapolis, where George Floyd was murdered at the hands of the police, where the Minneapolis City Council and the mayor, all Democrats, many of them corporate Democrats, made grand promises about reimagining and defunding and all kinds of really nice sounding words. But at the end of the day, they didn't really pass anything. And in Seattle, we did not win a 50% defund of the police, which was the demand of the movement. However, we did win cuts to the reductions in the police budget, and really using those dollars to instead fund community programs and restorative justice and affordable housing. But it's no coincidence that it was won here, because what you are seeing playing out in Seattle is something, unfortunately, I would say unique right now on the left in the United States, has been since we were elected. And we need to understand why it is that Seattle has been able to win these victories. It has been the important combination of street movements and progressive unions and socialists, including Socialist Alternative and the Democratic Socialists of America, really being on the forefront to fight for many of these demands, that in combination with the movement having its own voice through my city council office. So it's not so much about me, but the fact that our office has shown a fundamentally different approach to politics. We don't, when we got elected, we didn't see our role as being the best negotiators with the democratic establishment. We instead have won historic victories in terms of reforms by actually understanding the nature of capitalism, the nature of politics under capitalism, and understanding that the role of our office is to align itself to movements and basing ourselves on the strength of movements. And it is on that basis that we've been able to shift the balance of power towards movements away from the establishment, not through my insider phone calls to other Democratic Council members, which is why we won the $15 minimum wage. Seattle became the first major city to win that in 2014. Again, it was not a coincidence. It was precisely because we were elected to office and we had a movement fighting alongside us, and that our office had complete political clarity about what our role is. We didn't get elected and say, okay, now I need to stop being an activist. Now I need to start negotiating with other politicians. That is not, it can't work that way. And that is the reason why we have won some reductions in the police budget. But also what's striking here, Tisya, is that 6 of the 8 Democrats on the city council in the summer, when the movement was in its heyday, were forced to make verbal public promises. Some of those politicians, and these are Latina, progressive, or calling themselves progressive women, who cried, shed tears publicly saying, I've made lots of mistakes. They were referring to the fact that they all voted for a racist police contract 2 years ago, and I was the only no vote on that police contract, unfortunately, that year as well. But they were tearfully saying, please forgive me for those mistakes. And this year, I understand the movement is demanding 50% refund. I will absolutely stand with you. The moment the street heat was in decline, the Democrats went back to, well, we can't really do this. And actually, it will have detrimental effects on public safety, and making almost right-wing sounding arguments just a few weeks ago when the budget was voted on. And so I think what's important for us is not only the victories that we have won in the form of in terms of reforms, but I think really what's most important is for us to derive political lessons from the movement in Seattle and understand, why did we win what we did win? Why didn't the movement win what it didn't win? And so just on this note, I'll say that the reason we won the Amazon tax was absolutely because of the Black Lives Matter movement. And in fact, there was almost a mistake made by some of the Black Lives Matter leaders, and unfortunately even some of the DSA leaders, who said we should not be campaigning for the Amazon tax. We should just, stop this Amazon tax campaigning because it's only about police violence. We should not bring in this demand. But what we said in Socialist Alternative, which we didn't agree with that, and we said, no, actually we should test out this demand with the people themselves. All these tens of thousands of people who are out there in protest, let's ask them what they think. And it was incredible. We collected 20,000 signatures for the Amazon tax ballot petition in 20 days at the George Floyd protest. And it was precisely that, having a credible threat of a ballot initiative, and ultimately we collected 30,000 signatures that allowed us to win the Amazon tax despite all kinds of machinations, which I don't have time to go into, by both the city level and the state level Democratic establishment. That was also the reason why Seattle became the only city to win a ban on police use of chemical weapons. Again, all these legislation came out of my office, and it's not a coincidence because it is the movement's council office. And I think as far as defund police is concerned, as you were saying, it's really shameful, but of course not surprising to me. Obama absolutely is a champion of the political establishment and of Wall Street interests. And it's interesting to see how the corporate wing of the Democratic Party is drawing lessons, completely false, of course, but lessons that they want to draw, which is that, oh, well, we went too far left. Let's stop saying socialism. Let's stop saying defund. And I think this should be a wake-up call for us. The way they are going after Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and the left-leaning Congress members, it should be a lesson for us that ultimately that framework of having a capitalist-leaning party is not working for us, and that we need independent fighting movements, and those fighting movements need our own representation as well.
Nikhil, how do you kind of see like the future of the movement, and whether defunding the police is a possibility in Philadelphia and Pennsylvania, like as a whole?
One, I want to both applaud and kind of highlight the Councilmember Sawant's just point about the way that the protest, the uprising, and the protest over George Floyd's death, the Black Lives Matter rebellion in many different cities, and here in Pennsylvania, actually in virtually every municipality across the state. I want to underscore how, despite the kind of surface appeal of it being unpopular, there were movements everywhere, and there were movements around this everywhere, and that to express that that the deep dissatisfaction, the collapse of legitimacy of the current order around policing and prisons and its connection to investment elsewhere, disinvestment. But one thing that is important is the movement is a movement. It's against police brutality. It is against the investment in police, against against mass incarceration and death by incarceration. But it is also a movement for housing. It is a movement for fairness. I mean, it is a movement for equality, and a movement to end corporate control of our economy and to move to a just system. And so the Amazon tax flowing out of that is a perfect example. Here in Philadelphia, on the actual city budget level, the movement's ability to win, the cuts that it wanted or was demanding from the city government did not succeed, as it did not succeed in a number of other cities, as the council member mentioned. Though there was a kind of retreat from a certain kind of planned increase in the city budget. It's not going to end. We're going to continue to fight for it. But what did happen, and I think this is important to highlight, is there was a protest encampment of the unhoused on the Benjamin Franklin Parkway, which is very near the Art Museum, which a lot of people recognize as a symbolic kind of institution in Philadelphia. So one of the richest areas in the city, and in some sense a deeply subsidized area. We should indicate that it is an area that has received any number of state arts subsidies or whatever. So rich, but also rich because it has been made to be rich in some sense. So by incredible state and federal munificence in that regard. And so to have this encampment of several hundred people, if I'm not mistaken, there was one, and then there was actually one outside the headquarters of the Philadelphia Housing Authority protesting for housing, was a real challenge. I mean, a physical, palpable challenge to the housing options on offer from the city, to the shelter system, which is completely inadequate, and protesting for a housing first strategy. And despite a lot of the attempts by elected officials, by the community, and to pull back and to try to clear the encampment, for what it's worth, expressly recommended against by public health authorities to clear encampments of the unhoused during a pandemic. Nonetheless, they persisted, negotiated with the city with two left-wing members of the city council in support. I was in support in my role as a soon-to-be elected official in the state. The encampments were able to secure the transfer of city-owned properties to a community land trust. So this was this is unprecedented in Philadelphia history. It's obviously does not meet the actual need, but it begins to pioneer a version of how politics should be done, how movements can work with officials on the left in city government, and can transfer city resources, land, housing, to the movements in a manner that can render them permanently affordable. So I thought that was an instance in a way of a positive vision from an abolitionist impulse. To actually creating and producing the things that we need. So I think we need to continue to move in that direction. I believe that we need to secure housing, to secure healthcare, to secure that these things that are deeply part of this movement and that are part of the deeply lodged protest against capitalism and racial capitalism. So I feel very proud of the movements for that. And frankly, for pioneering that, for showing me the way, for showing us the way. So,
Sorry, yeah, I was muted. Yeah, that gives me a lot to chew on, and I also I'm sorry about this very slightly meta question. Which self-reflexivity is always really, really cool. And Nikhil, I'm sure you get asked about N+1 and that the journey from N+1 to state senate all the time. But I think this is a broader question about storytelling and the kinds of spaces that we need to make, right? Like, what is the current space that we are in right now, the four of us? Like, what is the space that we have currently created? What does it mean for us to be talking about these particular things? And I think I'd like to sort of we would love to keep you here all day. I can speak for Tisya when we say that, but I think that broader point about our politics being important and that being fundamental to the space that we've created, I just wonder what you think about the kinds of spaces, especially considering how leftist media it barely exists, in comparison to establishment media.
Yes, for sure. Of course, that's a very good question, and for sure that's certainly true. But I personally feel fairly optimistic, I would say, about the growth of the left-wing media sphere. I mean, that's not exactly the right term, but I mean, just journals and magazines and writing of the left. When N+1 started in 2004, and for people that don't know, it's a literary magazine of the left that has been around now. It's 16 years, quite old by little magazine standards. And I joined in 2005. It was fairly lonely at that point. There were a lot of institutionalized spaces which did not feel like adequate to meeting the moment. This was the nadir of the Iraq War. And there was the New York Review of Books and The Nation, somewhat on the left. And but beyond that, I mean, just, a lot of other magazines had failed, and it was not I personally did not find it a very inspiring time, despite, participation in the anti-war movement and things like that. Several years later, I think we're actually in a much better place. There's just a larger sphere, and partly there is a relationship between the movements and the growth of social movements, the growth of the left, the council members' election, to single out one, signal moment in a kind of, certainly in a series, or however you want to describe it, of making direct claims on political power. The very fact that we're then in conversation with a magazine, this didn't happen, 16 years ago. In a way, there weren't necessarily those officials in power. There were certainly movements, but we didn't have elected office to quite the same degree. And the notion that we could contest for elected office and that could have a virtuous effect on movement power and things like that, and then on a virtuous effect on what we speak about in the media. The other thing that has happened is organizing within media spaces. I mean, there were not many media unions, I will say, for the most part. I was interested in organizing one in my own time in book publishing, but had no models and no experience. It was what drew me ultimately to the labor movement as a volunteer organizer with Unite Here, which is the union of hotel and hospitality workers. But so I feel that, I feel optimistic about the growth of this. I feel optimistic about the insofar as the isolation is lessened profoundly. And that doesn't mean that there aren't severe constraints in terms of how you confront corporate media control. It's obviously consolidated in various ways. There's the growth of a very strong right-wing media sphere. I mean, that is immensely more powerful than it was when we all worried about talk radio and things like that in 2005. Which was in fact very powerful, but in a way we have it's considerably more so, and it's more sophisticated, I would say. And so there's certainly constraints, and so I don't want to be Pollyanna-ish about it. And moreover, and I've said this elsewhere, there's a kind of chauvinism, an American chauvinism in the media sphere, and so actually the existence of this project is very heartening to me as well. Just because there is just a national chauvinism and an inability to think about other countries, other languages, other traditions, indigenous, otherwise, and so I look forward to that as well. But overall, I feel heartened by the growth and the fact that a conversation like this is even taking place, and that we're all able to meet each other in this way. The Zoom context notwithstanding. But.
Kshama, I'd love to ask. It's a somber closing note for us, but there's both questions came from the audience, which is, the first is that with the recall attempt against you, which is extremely disheartening, and that a judge has a recall attempt to basically prevent you from being on city council, and that a judge has allowed that to go forward. And somebody else in the audience also asked if you would ever consider running for higher office. So that's a very pessimistic and a very optimistic note right next to each other.
Thanks for asking about that, Kamil. Although I would probably say I would probably agree with Nikil also that in overall, I think we should be extremely optimistic. But what it shows also that the path to winning a different kind of society is not going to be comfortable and easy. When we have attacks against our movements and the elected representatives or other representatives of the movements, it is a sign of the fact that we are having an impact and that it is angering the ruling class. So the recall attempt against my office, as you said correctly, Kamil, it's now at the state, it's at the level of the state Supreme Court. And on January 7th, the court is going to deliver a ruling. I mean, just like the police are not on the side of movements and working people and marginalized communities under capitalism, the courts and the judicial system aren't either. And so I would obviously urge everybody to have a sober understanding that this is, we should expect the courts not to be on our side, and we have to really prepare for a fight back. But here is where I think we should feel empowered, because understanding that these setbacks or these, efforts by the ruling class to defeat our movements are going to be an inevitable part of building a genuine class struggle. But if we don't build that class struggle, then what do we have? It's a completely dysfunctional status quo, or not only the pandemic crisis, the recession, the economic devastation people are feeling, and the poverty, but also the specific oppressions that are so widespread in our society, sexism, racism, and at the same time, the very future of the planet is at stake. So in that sense, as I would say, we should feel extremely empowered and feel when there are attacks from the ruling class, we should take that as a badge of honor for our movement, because they wouldn't be attacking us if we weren't having an impact. So in that sense, the recall attempt against us is very much in the context not only of what we have done here, which I want to get into in a second, but also in the context of, as we were all talking about earlier, a real crisis in the legitimacy of the capitalist system and its political representatives, and the rise of the left in many ways. We've seen movements in the middle of a pandemic. We have seen many DSA candidates being elected. Nikil's own election is an example of how many more progressives are being elected. This is not something that the ruling class under capitalism wants to see. They're absolutely fearful of the potential of social movements. They're not afraid of one individual here and there, but what they're afraid of is what role these elected offices could potentially play to galvanize a bigger struggle, which is what they're really afraid of. And I think the discussion we should be having, of course, is what is it that we have done here in Seattle that makes us such a threat to the ruling class that they are willing to go to this length, to actually use the courts. And now, of course, if the court allows go to the ballot to recall us. And I think what we have shown in Seattle through our office, as you said, Kamil, we've been in office since 2014, and so it's now almost 7 years. What we have shown is not just that we have some ideological position, which we of course do. It's based on our scientific analysis of capitalism. I mean, I am a socialist, I'm a Marxist. I've been very open about that. But what is really threatening to the establishment and the capitalist class, big business, Jeff Bezos, is that we have concretely used our office to win victories, to build movements and empower a broader layer of working people and marginalized communities. We haven't been on the fringe or in a marginalized position where we have a very pure position, but we have not achieved anything. What we have done actually is exactly what I was saying earlier, which is galvanized a larger layer of people to fight, to get into action and actually win victories. In fact, real estate lobbyist said it well when he said that when we tell all the Democrats to do the right thing meaning serving the corporate landlord lobby, but then when they come up against what they call Sawant's army, what they're referring to is obviously they want to make me out to be the reason for everything. But what is really happening is when they refer to our army, what they're referring to is the tens of thousands of people in our city, in our region, who have been emboldened to fight back. And every victory that we win emboldens them even further. And last year, when we ran for election, the re-election the second time, there was an onslaught by the Chamber of Commerce, by Amazon, by other big corporations, by Jeff Bezos himself. And they spent over $1 million trying to defeat us. They weren't able to. We were able to win. And what they are now attempting to do with this recall is a do-over of the election last year. And so I would say that there is tremendously this is at stake for the left as a whole, and especially for the socialist left, for mass movements, for the labor movement. And so I would urge everybody who's watching this not to think of this as, yes, we want the recall attempt to be defeated, but it's happening in Seattle. No, please see it as an attack on the left as a whole. In fact, out of the 4 charges against us, I mean, all of them are based in falsehood, but out of those 4 charges, fully 2 charges are directly related to our unstinted advocacy of the Black Lives Matter movement. So really, this is an attack on the Black Lives Matter movement. It is an attack on ordinary people having the courage, the temerity to stand up against an unjust system. And so if we don't unite and defeat this recall attempt, it is not going to be a defeat just for me and my office. It is going to be a defeat for the socialist left as a whole. We cannot let that happen, because if they succeed here, they will use this as a springboard, as a template to defeat other fighting movements elsewhere as well. And so I would really urge everybody to go to kshamasolidarity.org to find out more about our campaign. We need your donations. We have, again, we are up against a corporate onslaught, which means they have already raised $180,000. And as far as the question about higher office, I will say this: the very existence of our office is an alternative to politics as we know it, where career politicians often run from the Democratic or Republican Party. The way we ran our election, and the fact that we even ran for office, was a democratic decision by all the members of Socialist Alternative nationally on whether we should run, which city we should run in, what the campaign platform should be, and who our candidate should be. So it's in a way it's a model for what we need, I think, which is a new party for working people, for the marginalized community, for young people, for rank and file labor. And that party should have democratic structures through which we can hold our own elected representatives accountable, and we can fight for a program that actually represents the interests of the working class, and a party that is independent of corporate interests.
Well, I'd love to see it. And I just want to thank you both so much for your time.